to a candidate forum for the 40th District Legislative position, sponsored by News Talk WJAG in Norfolk and the Cedar County News. The candidates are incumbent Senator Tyson Larson of O'Neill and challenger Keith Kuby of Crofton. My name is Brad Hughes, the operating officer of WJAG Inc., and I will be the moderator for the forum this evening. Earlier this evening, the candidates drew for a speaking position. Mr. Kuby will give the first opening statement, while Mr. Larson will give the first answer to the first question. Each candidate will give a 3-minute opening statement. Mr. Ron Dump, one of our panelists, is the editor and publisher of the Northeast Nebraska News Company, and WJAG Associate News Directors Paul Hughes and Susan Reisinger will then ask questions of the candidates. As we mentioned to you earlier, audience questions will be taken as time allows. If you have a question and you've not yet had an opportunity to fill that out, or if you think of a question during the process, there are cards and writing utensils on the table where I am seated. You can come up at any time and grab one of those. At this time, I would like to acknowledge some of our colleagues in media that are here today, covering for their respective news entities. Please make welcome Lacey Kuntz from WNAX Radio in Yankton, Mike Becker from Hartelco Television, Diana Beckman from the Cedar County News, Randy Dockendorf from the Yankton Press in Dakotan, and Peggy Year from the Cedar County News. Did I miss any other media? We welcome you all and appreciate your participation and your coverage of the candidates as well. Each candidate will have 2 minutes to answer questions, and both candidates will be allowed to answer all questions. The opportunity to be the first to answer a question will alternate between the candidates this evening. At approximately 7:30, we're starting a little late, but approximately 7:30, we'll allow each candidate to ask one question of the other candidate, with Mr. Kuby asking the first question based on a drawing held earlier this evening. Candidates will have 2 minutes to answer these questions also. After the questions between the candidates, we will then return to questions from our media panel, and the evening will conclude with 90-second closing comments. Our timekeeper tonight is Matt Storm, seated up front. He will hold up a yellow card. It only matters to them, but it was yellow on that side. He will do so when 15 seconds of the allotted time remains. He will then hold up a red card when time has expired. As your moderator, there will be times where if they're finishing a thought, I will allow them to do so. At this time now, we will hear our opening statements from the candidates from the 40th District Legislative seat, and the first to do so will be Mr. Kuby.
Good evening. Thank you for being here. I'm gratified for the people who showed up here. I'd like to start off and say that we, the people of the United States, is the reason I am running in this race. We, the people of this country, are the leaders. I've been saying this throughout my campaign, that I believe that we, the people, as leaders, have a right, an obligation to select the best managers for this country, this state, this district. If you think about it, the leaders of this country are not our politicians. The leaders of this country are you. You own this country, just like you own your farm, your business, and you hire managers to run them. In hiring that manager, you expect that manager to know a little bit about the business. If you hire somebody to drive your truck and he doesn't know anything about trucks, you probably did not make a good hire. The same in the government. When we hire politicians, we are hiring managers to have them follow the rules of the Constitution. I believe that that function is one of the reasons why many of us are not happy with how the government runs today. Our government is being run by people who have no business experience. That business experience, if you're running a big business operation, is vital. So when we look at what we are trying to do, I am here applying for a job. I'm applying for a job as a manager. I'm here to explain to you how I think, how I work, what I've done in the past. And it's the same questions that you'd ask anybody that you're interviewing for a job. You want them, if they're driving your truck, to think like you, to take it to the right spot, not to call when it's running out of gas. not to call as to whether or not to turn left or right, or not have to sit in the truck cab with him. The same in our government. You're hiring someone that will think and act and do the things that you would expect to do. Thus, this interview is hopefully going to explain to you how I think, how I've done my business career to this point, how I solve problems, and how I would be able to work for you to make sure that as we're going forward, this country, this state, this district is there for the next generation. Because I'm not a politician. You are the leaders. Because the best leaders that we have, of course, are our parents, and we are. So with that, I hope that as we're going forward, you can appreciate where I've come from, the reason I'm running, the things that I would like to do, and the approach I'd like to take. And as that job application goes forward, I'd like to have you consider that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kuby. Senator Larson, your opening statement, please.
Thank you all for showing up, and I really appreciate the attendance here tonight. I think most of you know me. My name is Tyson Larson. I am your current state senator. Tonight, I will have to leave relatively soon after my wife has the flu, 102 temperature, aches and pains, and our 2 young children are with their great-grandparents, my grandparents, out of the ranch. I have a 6-year-old that's in kindergarten in O'Neill Public Schools and a 2-year-old that thinks I'm his permanent jungle gym that just crawls over me all the time and a joy in my life, but at the same time can be very interesting to deal with. I spent the last 4 years in the legislature, and it's been a great learning experience, and it's one that I've truly valued. I've been able to serve on multiple committees. My first 2 years, General Affairs, Judiciary, which dealt with pro-life issues, gun rights issues, juvenile justice issues, and agriculture, an issue that I know is very important to all of us in this room. And in the last 2 years, I've served on the Appropriations Committee, the Budget Committee, and it's been a great pleasure to serve on that committee and learn the ins and outs of state government and work for the people of Northeast Nebraska and get projects, whether they be a new swimming pool at Ponca State Park or faster roads funding to help Highway 12. It's been a great pleasure to be on the Appropriations Committee and work on that. During my time in the legislature, I've been part of 2 of the largest tax cuts in the state's history. 2 years ago, we cut income taxes for all Nebraskans, and this year we indexed income tax brackets as well as exempted Social Security income for those people living within District 40 from state income tax up to $65,000 in adjusted gross income, and exempted military retirement income for new military retirees. And we have worked hard in the legislature to move from one of the bottom 10 states in the country when it came to tax climate to now nearing the top half, and I'm proud of those accomplishments. I've also, focused a lot on agriculture. I brought national attention to issues such as horse processing in my first year, which was huge for the agricultural economy, and been able to work with programs like the Young Farmers Program to help bring young people back in and get involved in agriculture. The leadership that I have displayed, and I'm honored, but it has earned me the endorsement of organizations like Nebraska Farm Bureau, the Nebraska Cattlemen. As a small business owner myself, my wife and I own a small business. I've earned the endorsement of the Nebraska Chamber of Commerce and the Nebraska Federation of Businesses. I understand what it takes to own and run a business in small town Nebraska. It's been great, and I've had a great time during the last 4 years in the legislature, and I really appreciate your support, and let's have fun tonight.
All right, thank you, sir. Might I remind the candidates, because of the type of microphones that we are using, if you could pull them as close to your mouth, that would be helpful to get the right level out of each of you. So pull them up a little closer. It's easy for we radio guys to stick them in our face, but if you could slide them up a little closer, both of you, that would be helpful. Thank you, gentlemen. At this time, Northeast Nebraska News Company editor-publisher Ron Dumb and WJAG Associate News Directors Paul Hughes and Susan Reisinger will pose questions to each of the candidates. Again, each candidate will have 2 minutes to respond. Each candidate will have the chance to answer all questions, and the chance to answer first will rotate between the candidates. Again, if members of the audience do have questions at any time that you'd like to have asked of the candidates, please write those down on the cards provided and pass them on to a WJG team member. The first question will be from Mr. Dump, and it will be presented first to Senator Larson. Mr. Dump, please.
As a senator for District 40, you are one of a dwindling number of rural senators. What can you do in the legislature to best help rural Nebraska?
Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson, please.
That's a great question. And there are only 8 senators that live west of Grand Island. I'm one of those 8, and I only live, technically, as the crow flies, about 12 miles west of Grand Island. We stick together heavily in the Nebraska legislature. There are issues such as school funding that directly affect rural Nebraska heavily, and we continue to fight, especially as Omaha and Lincoln and Sarpy County now have 25, i.e. a majority of the Nebraska legislature. We work hard to educate our urban colleagues on issues such as agriculture. We build those relationships. Some of my closest relationships are Senator Lautenbach out of Omaha, or Senator Jansen running for state auditor from Fremont, or Senator Koash from Lincoln. Building those relationships takes time, and then those are relationships that I have built. And when you have those relationships, you can go to those senators and say, here's the issue facing rural Nebraska. Here's the issue that we are dealing with, whether it be with water, whether it be with school funding, or something ag-related. You have to have those relationships and be able to build those relationships to get things done in the legislature. And I've been fortunate enough to be able to build those relationships, not only with people from my own party, but work closely with people from across the aisle on certain issues that dealt with the environmental trust, or freezing tuition for the university system, so college students could have their tuition frozen for 2 years. We work hard. These are important issues to the whole state, and it's about building relationships in the Nebraska legislature, and I've been very pleased that I've been able to build those relationships the past 4 years.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Kuby, your response to the same question.
The question is how we're building relationships with Northeast or the rural states, right? Being born and raised on the farm and understanding the agricultural aspects of it, and I guess we always look at who is endorsing you. The Omaha World Herald endorsed my opponent. I gave the interview to the World Herald. I was knowing that I probably wouldn't get the endorsement. And I looked around and I didn't see Omaha in my district. And so as to whether or not we have somebody that gets the endorsement from the urban area, I don't know if that's a good idea or not. Being from the farm and understanding the farm issues, animal rights issues, agricultural issues, commodities, all the other aspects of which was part of my career, understanding and bringing an articulate message of having the people in the big cities who think they get their food from the grocery store and not from the farm, and they think that taxing these rich farmers is okay to fund their schools, to have 80% of all the money that goes to roads goes to the big cities. There needs to be someone who understands, can articulate, and defend these rural agricultural areas. Frankly, the only reason Nebraska exists is because of agriculture. Everything else in the state is a subsidiary of agriculture. If we don't have that kernel of corn growing out of the ground, nothing else happens. And so with that understanding, and having the people that are maybe not from the rural area, and having them understand that having our food come from the grocery store isn't how it works, and having them understand that we need to survive. But agriculture is frankly too big to fail. I've been able to defend it. I would defend it. It's in my roots. And I believe that I could probably manage in that respect to make sure that we get represented.
Thank you, Mr. Kuby. Time for a new question. Susan Reisinger, if you'd be so kind.
One of the biggest issues the legislature will deal with next year is the state's troubled corrections system. What will you support to deal with overcrowding, good time sentencing laws, and rehabilitative and mental health treatment for inmates?
Mr. Kuby, your response, please.
Prisons have been around since the beginning of time. The issue that I'm seeing in prisons is that it's becoming an industry in many of our communities. Prisons are a revenue source. It comes in, and the reason this is an issue that we have to look at is that the incentive not to pack our prisons full of prisons isn't in the cards. I don't know how the sentencing guidelines are for whether or not they're too harsh, as to whether or not the additional revenue that comes from prisoners that goes into communities are adequate or fair. We always say to solve that problem, we have to perfect the question. How many prisoners are too many? What sentencing guidelines should we relax? What issues are going on in a community that could possibly be detrimental if the prisons close? How does the people in this community feel about releases? Are the sentencing guidelines too harsh? Have there been wrongful convictions? So unless we know the answers to those questions, unless we can perfect the question, engineers were always taught, if you ask the question exactly enough and have all the things that you definitely need to address considered, the answer is right there. So once we look at this model, answer the questions that we talked about, once I have that understood, it would be a lot easier to address. And so there's a lot of issues that are around the circumference of that particular question before we can probably articulate a logical, sensible answer, because there's a lot of repercussions depending upon what we do.
Thank you, Mr. Kuby. Mr. Larson, your response, please.
Thank you. And serving on the Judiciary Committee, I actually do have a lot of the information directly affecting the question. I would support moving good time to earned time. Just because you serve a day in prison doesn't mean you should get a day off of your sentence. Nico Jenkins, the person that committed those heinous crimes in Omaha, had earned time, or had good time, even though he tried to start a prison riot, even though they found a knife in his jail cell, even though he was not an exemplary prisoner. Yet he still got good time. That is wrong. And last year we tried to switch it from good time to earned time, and the Judiciary Committee stifled us. So that is the first thing we need to do when it comes to corrections. We do need to move it from good time to earned time. We talk about probation and prison overcrowding, and we're reaching those limits. I think we have programs in Nebraska such as Drug Court that is moving people through a more probationary period, working with lawyers in the communities and judges, and keeping them out of our prisons and actually rehabilitating them that are doing some really good things. O'Neill has a drug court now. I know Norfolk does. I'm not sure if Hartington has a drug court yet. But this is something that we can emulate farther down the line for nonviolent offenders. Because the violent offenders obviously need to go to prison, but the nonviolent offenders, is there ways that we can rehabilitate them? We've done studies that show that a prisoner costs 11 times more in prison than if we have them on probation through these things such as drug court. So we need to continue to foster these types of things to save the state money. Last year, the Appropriations Committee considered this heavily when we were looking at moving prisoners and prison overcrowding, and we have actually moved some prisoners into some county jails that could handle those types of prisoners, Lancaster and Hall County. And that's something we're going to have to continue to do if we don't take steps when it comes to drug court, probation, and earned time. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Larson. Time for a new question. Paul Hughes, please.
Nebraska has the second lowest unemployment rate in the nation. Employers are reporting that they have jobs, including many well-paying jobs, but too few skilled workers to fill them. How do we create the needed skilled workforce? And on a related note, what actions do we need to take to keep young Nebraskans from migrating to other states upon graduation?
Mr. Larson, please.
The way we continue to educate and create that skilled workforce is what the legislature has been doing. And that's continuing to make higher education more affordable and continue to encourage our young students to go to our community and tech schools. And that's why we see Northeast Community College and the community colleges across the state continuing to grow. I think Northeast is even opening a small office here in Hartington. And that's very important. The legislature is taking this higher education very seriously. As I already mentioned, we had a tuition freeze for the entire university system, including community colleges, 2 years ago. And that's because we want to make college affordable. And if college isn't affordable and we have a good system through our teachers and our K-12 education to show them that it is affordable and there are opportunities for them as they move in or move up, we will see more kids take advantage of that. The job market in rural Nebraska is very difficult. In O'Neill, for example, Subway is offering their employees $9.50 an hour just to start because no one is there to take the job because unemployment is so low. That's a curse and a blessing all at the same time. Our rural communities are thriving because of agriculture, but we do need more people coming back. I tell everybody, at the age of 17, I grew up in this small town, and at the age of 17, I wanted to leave Nebraska, but at the age of 22, I was ready to come home. And that's because the rural Nebraska has something special to offer. It's a place to raise a family. And I think when in Holt County, the economic development director gives a mailbox to every kid when they graduate. And that mailbox symbolizes when you're ready to come home, here's your address, because this is where home is. And we have to continue to impress that upon our kids, that this is a great place to raise a family.
Thank you, Senator Larson. Mr. Kuby, your response, please, to the same question.
I've had the blessing, Bloomfield is here represented tonight. I frankly spoke to 17 schools and 2 colleges during this campaign, addressing success, leadership, business, and government. The things that I've found that seem to be ringing more true is, first of all, having our students understand that we own the country. We are the leaders. We are going to school to learn how to work for ourselves. We all have to work for somebody else at the beginning, and I always tell the students, you will always be working for someone else who is not as smart as you when you get out. Deal with it. But as you go along, you are here to learn how to work for yourself, and you're in school to learn how to be self-reliant. Learn how to deal with the things that happen to us. We in agricultural areas are blessed because it seems to be in our genetics. When we have students that are self-reliant and understand they're there not to learn history or geography or English, but they're there to understand that these are tools that are going to be used when they come up with problems that they weren't used to having. If they get out of school and they don't have the welding job or the nursing job, I don't want them to think, well, I can go back to the government and get this taken care of. We have to teach them how to survive. The next thing is that as they are going through, having that self-reliance place there, they are here to eventually learn how to solve problems. You will always have a job if you can solve problems. Engineers are taught how to solve problems. Managers are paid to solve problems. Thus, when we are in fact teaching our kids, the problem-solving model that I mentioned before is very important, and if nothing else is learned, understanding how to solve problems will get you your key to success in life.
Thank you, Mr. Kuby. A new question now. Our next question comes from our panelist, Mr. Rob Dump, whom again is the editor and publisher of the Northeast Nebraska News Company. Mr. Dump, please.
I'm sure you both have either read about or attended meetings concerning a proposed 5-school merger in Knox County and Pierce counties. 3 Cedar County communities also went through school mergers this year. Is there anything that can be done with the state aid formula or other incentives to help keep our small schools intact?
Mr. Kuby, please.
In my speeches to various students, the school consolidation is practically the one that comes up all the time. And to consolidate a school is a very, very tough and hurtful thing. This is not meant to be a joke, but I guess it comes down to that way. The best solution to school consolidation is pro-life. If you have a lot of kids, you will have schools. The second thing, of which we don't think about, is that when we go through our lives, when we buy a $500,000 tractor, that actually contributes to school consolidation. We don't need as many people on the farm anymore. Thus, the schools will consolidate. The thing that I teach the students when we talk about school consolidation is, How far are you willing to drive? How much per student are your parents willing to pay? How much are you allowing for unemployment of the schools, of the teachers that are not going to be able to live in those communities? Back to perfecting the question. Unintended consequences, I'm not saying nobody should buy a $500,000 tractor, but we are doing the various things which have been happening in western Nebraska for 30 years. Bassett was a classic example. I always amazed that Bassett was a school that had dormitories. And I couldn't imagine going and not coming home for a week, every week, as I was going, just like you were going to college. And so consolidation, as it goes, back to perfecting the question, how much are we willing to pay? What are we willing to give up? Is it going to be viable? And I guess, like we say, I won't compromise my core values of fairness, honesty, integrity, and longevity, but in consolidation, there will be things that we probably have to compromise on. Things that we like. I wish I could keep them, but again, I wish I was taller and better looking too.
Thank you, Mr. Kuby. Mr. Larson, please.
Thank you, Rob, for the question. When we talk about the state aid formula, it's something that is complex, and rural Nebraska continues to lose to Omaha and Lincoln. I was actually having a conversation today with the superintendent from Wynot, that Wynot is one of the handful of schools in this legislative district that receives state aid, but they are going to lose it in the next year or two. Lynch, another school district that receives state aid, is going to lose it in a year or two because the valuations continue to rise. And what we're seeing is the state constitution says that the state of Nebraska has a responsibility to provide a K-12 education for every kid in the state of Nebraska. Yet our property tax dollars are paying for the education of our kids, and our sales and income tax dollars are paying for the education of Omaha and Lincoln's kids. So we're paying them both up. Rob's earlier question hits the point on the head in terms of young or urban versus rural, and what do we do as rural senators to stand up and fight? And this is where we have stood up and said this is something that is wrong. We don't disagree with the $1 billion that is going to K-12 education. We disagree where it's going. I think the formula has to change. The formula has to either move to something that is more of a per pupil basis or doesn't punish schools that drop below the 95-cent cap levy. Things of that nature, because if the formula continues to go where it is, in the next 1 to 2 years, no school district, maybe 3 to 4, no school district in my legislative district will receive any state aid. And that's wrong, because our students are worth just as much as any student in Omaha and Lincoln. And we have to remember that. So hopefully there will be changes, and if we can't get it done legislatively, I'd look to see hopefully schools like O'Neill, Hardington, Ainsworth, Valentine come together and work to actually sue the state, because that's what it might come down to with Omaha and Lincoln getting over 25 votes in the legislature right now.
Thank you, Senator Larson. Let's do one more question before the candidates have an opportunity to pose a question to each other. Our next question comes from Susan Reinsinger.
Local law enforcement officials are struggling to deal with mentally ill individuals who end up in their jails instead of in treatment facilities. How do you propose to meet the needs of the state's mentally ill citizens?
Senator Larson, please.
As a member of Appropriations Committee, we dealt heavily with mental illness patients. I know Norfolk is oftentimes overbooked, and I was actually with my wife watching a 60 Minutes, I think, of how our mental health system is actually, we're just taking people into the hospital, into the ER, and not actually working with the problems. We took a step on 2 levels last year on the Appropriations Committee to put more funding into the mental illness treatment plans across the regions of the state of Nebraska. And that's something I think we have to continue to look at, because these people aren't just a danger to themselves, they're a danger to society. When we hear about the mass shootings, when we hear about these problems that are happening across our country, most of these people have cried out, have been into the hospital. So we need to have a better detection system. It isn't just throwing money at the problem, but we have to have a system in which we can move, transport, and house these patients to get them the care and the services they need. Again, I'll come to the Nico Jenkins case in the prison system. They had a doctor that said that he had mental illnesses, but the Department of Corrections, and we now know how screwed up the Department of Corrections is, as we have been learning in the paper the last few weeks, that they ignored these problems with Nico Jenkins. He goes on to kill 4 people in a span of 2 days. So we have to do something to make sure that these people have an outlet, or else they're going to come back and bite our communities in the butt with their actions if they're not being treated, and that's the last thing we want.
Thank you, Senator Larson. Mr. Kuby.
Situations regarding mental illness, again, is an age-old problem, and there are very, very sad consequences that come out of those things if they're not properly handled. I often debate as to whether or not it should be a state institutional sort of thing to deal with. We've had mental hospitals around since I was a boy. Yankton, of course, had a mental hospital, and it was a scary place. As we deal with this, and I guess back to perfecting the question, how many patients are we really trying to deal with? How much per patient is enough? How long do we have to, in fact, treat them? Is there an end in sight? Do we find that doing those sorts of things is really helpful? Is the state most qualified to do that? All these questions are a matter of perfecting the question so that I can give you an answer as to how to handle it. No one likes to see someone who is mentally ill not get the proper treatment, just the same as somebody who is sick not getting a proper treatment. We live in a compassionate country, a compassionate state. We are compassionate people. They have an answer that says we'll put money at it, and I guess it comes back to, as I look at these sorts of things, I have to make sure that we are investing and not spending. And it is a tough differentiation for those that do not have business background to make that determination. Buying beer is spending. Buying seed corn is investing. If we invest in a system that seems to have efficacy or frankly works, by all means we should try that. And again, we've been trying to do this for generations, and as to how effective it is, I wish it would go away. I don't think it'll ever go away. It will probably be a social problem that we'll deal with for a long time. It really boils down to how much are the citizens of the state prepared to spend or invest to hopefully solve the problem.
Thank you, Mr. Kuby. Thank you, candidates. At this time, the candidates will be allowed to pose a question to each other. Answers will be, again, up to 2 minutes in length. Based on the drawing held earlier this evening, Mr. Kuby will ask the first question. Mr. Kuby, please.
I guess the approach that I was going to think about is that when we get endorsements, it's important to understand that those endorsements mean that the person that is endorsing you thinks like you. If you get endorsement from the World Herald, you're thinking like the World Herald. If you get an endorsement from Adrian Smith, why would he endorse you? Is it because he wants you to win so that you don't have to run against him, so you don't run against him the next time? I guess if you in fact have people who do not think like you, but yet you are calling out and asking them to endorse you, or frankly claim that they do endorse you, how do you reconcile the fact that sometimes you are actually associating with issues that are probably contrary to their platform?
I tell everybody, nobody in this room is going to agree 100% of the time. There isn't anybody that if they were in Lincoln would make the exact same decision that I do every single time. I'm proud to have the endorsement of people like Adrian Smith, John Bruni, the Nebraska Chamber of Commerce, Nebraska Farm Bureau, Nebraska Cattlemen, Nebraska Federation of Independent Businesses, Pete Ricketts. And I'm not going to agree with each one of those people 100% of the time. Or the Omaha World Herald that did also endorse me. They understand that. But they do believe that I am the best person to represent this district. And when we move forward, that's what this is about. As I said, none of us are always going to agree. And when we disagree, it's my job to tell you why we disagree and why the decision that I make in Lincoln is how I feel is best for the district. And we might continue to disagree, and 95% of the time, we'll come to an understanding, and we'll move on. And I think that's what the concept of the endorsements that I've received are. We won't always agree with every one of the people that have endorsed me, but I've shown and demonstrated the leadership that has given them the confidence to put their name behind mine. And I appreciate every one of those endorsements, and I don't run from any of them. So I appreciate the question, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about that.
Thank you, Senator Larson. Now your opportunity to ask a question of your opponent, Mr. Kuby.
Mr. Kuby, on your website, you put or publicly published the Nebraska Farm Bureau survey, and there was a question specifically that dealt with water funding on that survey, and you stated that you would support a fee on irrigated water users, i.e. our irrigation users, and a new tax on bottled water. Can you please explain those answers on your Nebraska Farm Bureau survey, why you would support a fee on irrigated water users and on bottled water?
The aspect of being a good neighbor or having a good neighbor policy in dealing with water issues is always a concern. Water issues in the state are managed by the boards of the various NRD districts. As they do what they do, and we all want to survive, and if in fact they overuse a resource and it causes their neighbor's well to go dry, do we want to legislate something that says stop pumping so much, or should we go to some sort of standard whereby an unlimited amount of water can be pumped out of the ground, whoa, who cares about my neighbor, is stopped? Again, all laws are made, and if any law is made, it usually upsets somebody. The best law is no law. The best law would be having to not tell your neighbor that I don't care, or better says, not tell your neighbor to stop pumping so much. As the system goes, there's any number of ways to in fact start to control things as to whether or not we want to tax them, or meter it, or look at other alternatives. All of them back to the good neighbor policy. I'm only a manager, and I'm applying for a job as a manager. I'm not a dictator. If you look at what we have, we, the leader, people of the United States who lead, the only people in this country who call politicians leaders are the media, other politicians, and those that flunked American history class. We have managers and top managers. Russia, Syria, North Korea have leaders, and they're called dictators. And so this job of management, of dealing with water resources, is, again, one of those things that I'm not going to dictate what should happen. All I can do is kind of extrapolate or look forward as to what unintended consequences and what we're trying to head off, so that I do not have to make a law that violates because everybody's not being a good neighbor.
Thank you, Mr. Kuby. We will now have more questions asked by our media panel. Again, audience members, you're reminded that you may submit a written question for consideration. Cards and pencils are still up here on the table. If anybody came in late, please come on up and grab them if you'd like. And then please pass your questions to a member of the WJAG staff. Moving right along, our next question will come from Paul Hughes. Mr. Hughes.
A number of our audience members have asked about the Keystone XL oil pipeline. What is your position on the Keystone XL?
And the first to respond will be Mr. Kuby.
I have been around pipelines for a third of my career, a student after that fact, after it's kind of a hobby. I was a petrochemical engineer until about the early 80s. Been around pipelines. I have no reason to be, I found no reason to be against the pipeline. The pipeline issue is probably the safest one in the country. There's about 40,000 miles of them around. In my career, I've never seen a pipeline break, irreparably damage a pipe or an aquifer. Not to say that it couldn't happen. When we were looking at it in the 80s, these kind of issues, it is probably impossible. We probably have a greater chance of being hit by a meteor than having a pipeline break and causing the aquifer to be damaged. Should we be flippant about it? By no means. I don't want dirt on the ground any more than anyone else does. I want my son to be growing up in a country which is clean, that protects the environment, that's careful with it. I wish that we would be able to do things and it would be completely invisible. But when we drive home tonight, when we live, when we heat our houses. If we want to stop doing all that, then, of course, we can solve the pipeline. Don't build it. But I don't think that'll happen. And so, again, from my point of view as an engineer, as a business guy, and looking at these for, frankly, my whole career, I have not found any technical reason to be against it. Has it been fair? No. Have there been things that were not right? No. Yes, there were things that were not right. Were there people taken advantage of? Were their integrity sometimes compromised? Were they lied to? Probably. That's another issue. So we've got two issues. One, is the pipeline technically sound? Yes. Is it done fairly? Probably not. There's probably issues there. It's sad that the two get confused.
Mr. Larson, please.
When I got into the legislature 4 years ago, the state of Nebraska had little to no regulations on oil pipelines. During my 4 years in the legislature, mainly because of Keystone XL, we've actually moved from no regulations on pipelines to some of the most strict regulations in the nation to ensure that if this pipeline does go through, that it will be the safest, most effective pipeline in the nation. And that's something that's what the legislature can do. We can't say yes to the pipeline. We can't say no to the pipeline. It's one of those issues that will be decided by the President of the United States and the United States Secretary of State, John Kerry. John Boehner can increase that decision if he should so choose to try to push it through the House. But it's something that our responsibility on the legislative level is to make it as safe as possible. And that is what we have done. If it goes through Polk County, part of Antelope, it'll sneak into Boyd, so it could have 2 counties of this legislative district. It will be safe. It's one of those tough issues that you'll hear a lot about on each side, but we've done what we can do at the Nebraska legislative level, and I'm proud of that.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. Our next question comes from Mr. Rob Dunn.
I have a fairly simple question. If elected, what would be the first bill you'd introduce in the legislature?
Senator Larson.
I actually have been working on a bill that deals with crowdfunding. That will probably be the first one, right? We have 10 days in the legislative session to introduce bills, and the concept is to increase investment, especially for startups and entrepreneurs in Nebraska. We've seen, or some of us may have seen some bills called some apps called Kickstarter or WeFund or things like that. And we must continue to embrace technology and give people extra avenues to invest in our entrepreneurs. As someone that owns a small business and is continuing to look at investment opportunities, I want to be able to have every opportunity available. And Nebraska has been shortchanging, or our laws actually inhibit entrepreneurs and the investment types that we can make. So I've been working with my staff to develop a bill that will allow crowdfunding and allow our companies, or our small startups, to go online and essentially fund from anybody across the nation without having to go onto the stock exchange or having to call 1,000 different people. We have to use the technology that we have, and we must harness that technology to continue to grow. We've seen great things you watch what Texas has done. They're a very conservative legislature. What they've done in Austin, they call it the Silicon Prairie. How can we emulate things like that, and how can we make Nebraska more competitive? So I actually think that will be the first bill that that will get pushed into the hopper, is something to continue to help rural economic development and give our business people and our entrepreneurs a way to get investment and bring investment to rural Nebraska.
Thank you, Senator Larson. Mr. Kuby, your response to the same question.
I've probably analyzed over 1,000 businesses, and I would always tell my clients when they come in that if you are calling yourself an entrepreneur, you're actually insulting yourself. An entrepreneur on your resume is about as flattering as, say, I graduated from grade school. Entrepreneurs are just immature businesses that haven't grown up yet. The real problem with business is to make sure that the climate that they're operating in is to the point where the tax law encourages success. I mentioned this at the other debate. Entrepreneurs have to grow up. Children have to grow up. They have to get through that curve. Having money inserted in those young entrepreneurial aspects many times causes businesses that shouldn't survive to survive and possibly be on soft soil going forward. Therefore, when they have to get out of the subsidies that they in fact use to get started, they fail. And so, having done about 1,000 of these businesses and understand how they work and how they function, businesses are simply animals, things that generate more money than they, of course, spend. The fundamentals of business is what I'm talking about when I talk to the students in school. I will give lectures next semester, regardless of what happens to this race, on how businesses should be ran. Having done a lot of them, it is relatively simple. I always say running a business is probably more complicated, or more simple than driving a car. My sister can drive a car, but once a business is built, and it's built right, with the gauges making sense, anybody can run it. And so what I would do is the same thing. Teach them that businesses and cars are more or less the same thing. They're there to make sure you get from point A to point B with gauges to make sure that you're not off track and going out of business before you in fact even know you're sick.
All right, thank you very much. Our next question comes from Susan Reisinger.
Several of our audience members have posed questions about property taxes. So let's talk about the entities that spend property taxes. Cities, counties, schools, NRDs, community colleges. How are they to continue to fund their enterprises as we tweak with property taxes, whether it's to put caps on, whether it is to control the valuation increases? Let's talk about funding those. There's also been some talk about taking the inheritance tax away from counties. How do we provide local services if we don't have property taxes?
Mr. Kuby, please.
The tax model, and I guess property tax is a good one, always confused me as to how it got as far as it did. If you look as to how it's structured, the people in the urban areas love it considerably more than we in the rural areas. In the city areas, they're taxed on their house. The schools are funded. A given house, this many dollars, it goes this many dollars and it goes to the school. That formula in the country is the same, but they are taxed in the country, not on their house, but on their net worth. They use their net worth to make a living. Having them taxed on the vehicle that's used to make their living and then pay income tax on it besides isn't fair. The people in the city pay tax on their house, but they work at someone else's building with someone else's net worth. And so, just by the way the formula is set up initially, it is unfair. You are taxing those people who are self-sufficient, use a large net worth to make their living, and then be taxed on it besides. And again, the other thing is that they don't know where our food comes from, but the bigger issue is, well, these rich farmers can afford it. They've got all this land, it's worth so many dollars. I don't understand why they can't just chip in a little bit now and then. And of course, this fairness formula comes up. It's explanations like that that I think are necessary to have them understand, because I always say fair means if you had the tables flipped, would you still agree to the same deal? And I'll bet you a nickel that the people in the country, if in fact they had to deal with what the farmers here are dealing with, they would think twice about agreeing to it. And again, taxes are meant to incentivize those things which we in society feel are important. Again, perfecting the question.
Thank you, Mr. Kuby. Senator Larson, your response to the question.
During my time in the legislature, we focused a lot on property taxes. I've been proud to help initiate nearly $500 million in property tax relief. That's taking sales and income tax dollars and putting it directly back into landowners' pockets. As many of us know, all of us know, the state spends zero property tax dollars. All that's spent at the local level. In my 4 years in the legislature, our budget increases have been 2.4%, right around 3%, 4.5%, and just over 5%. If we look at our local entities, some of their budgets have been across the entire state. Many of their budgets have increased much more dramatically than that because as the market valuations are continuing to rise, the levies aren't dropping as fast as the valuations are rising. Therefore, they're bringing in more money. And that's something that we have to continue to be cognizant of, is we have to hold down spending at every level of government. And we have to continue to be cognizant of that and moving forward. In my own school district, O'Neill Public Schools, our superintendent finally did lower the levy from 98 cents to 91 cents. Now, is that fair when you look just to the west of me, where West Holt Schools is at 57 cents? Not quite. We can still probably go down a little bit. And O'Neill Public Schools is putting money into building funds and whatever else, but they're spending more at the local level than might be necessary, or saving money in different ways. And we have to continue to hold all elected officials, not just those of us that are elected to statewide offices or state offices such as myself or our governor, but also those that are elected to our local offices, because they have just as much power in spending decisions and your taxes as I do oftentimes.
You're listening to a candidate forum for Nebraska's 40th District Legislative position, sponsored by Newstalk WJAG and the Cedar County News, between candidates, the incumbent Tyson Larson of O'Neill and his challenger Keith Kuby of Crofton. That does now conclude the question and answer portion of our forum this evening. We will now hear our closing statements from each of our candidates, with the first coming from Mr. Kuby.
Thank you. I hope tonight we are able to demonstrate, or if nothing else, show how I think. I'm applying for a job as a manager. These managers need to, in fact, make sure that we have a business model in the government that will, in fact, survive. I think spending instead of investing, and understanding the long-term effects of these things through problem-solving approaches that I've been fortunate to, in fact, have a lot of practice with, is something that you would want to see in a manager. And again, having the endorsements of the Right to Life people, understand that many of these endorsements, the Farm Bureau, Right to Life, the NRA, they're incumbent. And they give that election because they don't know me from Adam. I came in late on the scene, no war chest to work from. I guess the other part about having those endorsements come along, it's important to also realize that when someone does endorse you, then you have to realize that they are essentially agreeing with you. And even though Mr. Larson may say, well, they may not agree with me, but they're in fact there, I contend that they do not know what I am or who I am, and I hope that makes a difference. And I guess as we go forward, I would like to have you, in your heart of hearts, select the best manager to manage this district for you in the next legislative session.
Thank you, Mr. Kuby. Mr. Larson, please, your closing comments.
Thank you again all for coming. I really appreciate it. The crowd has been is much larger than the one we had in the Western Forum, and I think that speaks tantamount to the civic involvement that we have over here, and I really appreciate it. During the last 4 years, I've had a great opportunity to grow and develop relationships in the legislature and do some really good things for Nebraska, and we're starting to see those things come to fruition. We're starting to see Nebraska become more competitive when it comes to our tax climate. We're starting to see the reverse of rural growth decline. We're starting to see some really good things happen in Nebraska, and I'm very proud to have been a part of that. And I hope moving forward, I have another 4 years to continue to be part of that, because there are strides that we can make. When I ran for office 4 years ago, I ran because I wanted to give my generation a voice, but at the same time, I want to make a better place for my 6-year-old and my 2-year-old, to where they have a better opportunity to start their own business in rural Nebraska, to where they have a better opportunity to go to the university and get a great education. And that's what this is about. And I've been proud to be able to do things in the legislature the last 4 years to ensure that. And I know that I will be able to do that in the next 4 years. So I appreciate it, and I'd sure appreciate your support on November 4th. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. Thank you to both of our candidates for participating in tonight's forum and for your interest in serving in the Nebraska legislature. Also, a very special thank you to our staff from WJAG who helped facilitate and coordinate the events this evening, including Matt Stocking, our timekeeper, Jeff Steffen, our operations manager, Paul Hughes, and Susan Reisinger from our news department. And also a very heartfelt thank you to Mr. Rob Dump from the newspapers up in this area for your participation on the panel and helping and participating and supporting and sponsoring. We appreciate it very much. We do encourage all citizens to vote on or before Tuesday, November 4th. For those of you who have requested early ballots, we remind you that those must be returned to the county clerk's office before the polls close on election day. And for those of you planning to return those ballots in the mail, please allow a few days for the ballots to reach the clerk's office on or before November 4th. If you need to register to vote or update your registration, you may still do so by registering in person at your county election official's office through 6 p.m. this Friday. That must be done by this Friday. Election coverage, of course, will begin at 8 p.m. on November 4th on News Talk WJAG 780 AM and 105.9 FM, on Light Rock 97.5, and also on 106 Kicks, that's 106.7 FM. We invite you to tune in for local, state, and national results that evening. And that concludes tonight's forum, sponsored by the Cedar County News and News Talk WJAG. And we thank you all very much and wish you safe travels home. Thanks for joining us this evening.